My name is Lynn Ann Rockhill. I was invited by Project Freedom United to read my recent article about freedom, and it's entitled Hell Ship in Wallabout Bay, New York, 1776. It's about a British prison ship called the HMS Jersey. The article, what it does is it tells you how history repeats itself in the United States, and this is what's going on right now. It begins with a quote by Jonathan Russell of Providence, Rhode Island, on July 4th, 1800. "You ought to remember them. You ought to hand them down in tradition to your posterity, that they may know the awful price their fathers paid for freedom." This is the story of a British prisoner of war ship called HMS Jersey. This old, unsightly, and leaking hulk, anchored in Wallabout Bay, New York, was once a proud ship in His Majesty's Navy before the Revolutionary War. She carried 60 guns, and on her prow was a figurehead of the Lion of England. She roamed the seven seas and battled those who challenged her. She was once a notable man of war. On the 29th of June, 1745, while under the command of Captain Charles Hardy, HMS Jersey engaged with the French ship Saint-Esprit of 74 guns in one of the most desperate sea battles on record, called the War of the Austrian Succession, from 1740 to 1748. Saint-Esprit's commander was Charles Antoine d'Albert Duchesne, 2nd Marquis d'Albert Duchesne, and their combat lasted 2.5 hours until Saint-Esprit was forced to withdraw because of damages. She sailed back to Cadiz, Spain for repairs. The Saint-Esprit was eventually refitted for sea, but the HMS Jersey was badly impaired and left as unfit for active service. However, with the renewal of hostilities with France in 1756, HMS Jersey was refitted for service. By spring of 1769, under the flag of Commodore Sir John Byron, HMS Jersey sailed for America. By summer's end, she returned to England, where her active service was brought to an end. Jersey remained dormant until 1776, when, without armament, she was ordered to New York as a hospital ship under the command of Captain Anthony Halstead. Captain Halstead died in 1778 and was replaced by Commander David Laird. Wallabout Bay is located on the eastern shore of the East River near New York's Brooklyn Naval Yard. The British anchored their prisoner of war ships in the bay to make escapes impossible, since escapes from a stockade on land were predictable and fewer guards would be needed to watch the prisoners. In 1776, the first British prison ship that anchored in New York's Wallabout Bay was a large transport called Whitby. Then in 1777, 8 more prison ships were added: Good Hope, Scorpion, Prince of Wales, Falmouth, Hunter, Stromboli, John, and the Jersey. 2 of these 8 vessels were destroyed by fires set by prisoners who desperately wanted to be free from the cruelty, disease, and starvation. They were desperate to escape, and if that didn't work out, they decided it would be better to be burned alive than endure a cruel death of slow starvation. Of all these prison ships, the HMS Jersey was the most lethal. It was Britain's kiss of death. All of Jersey's portholes were battened with narrow strips of wood over canvas and sealed, and in the hull 2 tiers of 20-inch squares were cut about 10 feet apart as air vents, which were barred and secured with iron. The starboard deck had a spar fitted to use for hoisting supplies. A tent was erected on the quarterdeck for the guards, and a 10-foot barricade with a door and rifle loopholes to protect them from escaping prisoners. The crew had a captain, 2 mates, a steward, cook, 12 sailors, a guard of 10 Marines, as well as 30 soldiers. The prisoner guards were recruits from a Highland regiment stationed on Long Island, British Marines, and a squad of Hessian mercenaries. Records show the Scottish guardsmen deliberately made life miserable for the prisoners, and the British guards were not much better. The Hessians, however, were said to be merciful to the prisoners, and would intentionally help alleviate their fate when the Brits and Scots were not paying attention. There was no other British prison ship in the American Revolution that could outdo the Jersey's deliberate, savage treatment of American prisoners. The British willfully inflicted pain, were delighted or indifferent to the prisoner's pain, and were merciless. Such cruelty is sadistic and a typical abuse from those in power, and it doesn't matter the century. The Jersey's captors felt their behavior vindicated their anger and hatred with the colonial patriots who were rebellious and violent against the crown. But for the unfortunate New York patriots captured by the British, they soon discovered they were victims to Jersey's ghoulish hell. Generally, the Jersey maintained 1,000 prisoners in her cargo holds, but it was more often than not that there were 1,200 prisoners at one time. Captured officers were quartered in the gunroom, and they fared only slightly better than the captured men in the decks below. A nauseating stench rose from the dark decks below as the new prisoner descended into the underbelly. There was no sanitation support. Dysentery and unwashed, diseased bodies spread throughout the decks. Colorless faces stare vacantly at the new stranger as he moves slowly about the madness in the room. The new prisoner shrinks from any physical contact with any of the living dead. By the end of day, the cargo deck grew darker still. The sick moaned and whimpered, while the delirious ranted endlessly into the blackness. So many disfigured bodies, some covered with old, torn blankets, and others with only pieces of rags taken from the dead. Never a doctor or clergyman was ever allowed to come and comfort their minds or ease the suffering of their poor bodies. Food was repulsive, vile. The British insisted the prisoners' rations were 2/3 the quantity of their own rations. But the quality of the prisoners' food rations was never mentioned. The essential food served was oatmeal and green peas cooked in large copper cauldrons, with sometimes old bread with worms or pieces of rotten meat. And water was hard to get. The consequences of such treatment is not unexpected, and certainly not surprising that a plague would spread among the starving. Dreams of escape filled the minds of the desperate. Some tried, but success was extremely difficult. In order to escape, the route was a risky gamble the moment a prisoner left the ship. The first obstacle to clear was to avoid the guards and get over the side of the ship. Once in the water, the prisoner had to be in good physical condition in order to swim underwater and stay out of sight from both guard and musket fire. Should he manage to land on Long Island, he'd have to dodge his way around sentry lines of the British Occupational Army, and if he got that far, he would need to be extremely cautious about moving about the countryside without running into a Tory or Royalist who would do anything for the reward of returning an escapee. Anything. Being recaptured would be certain death from torture and starvation. The burial party. Under heavy guard, chosen prisoners were forced to row the tragic dead men to shore. The spot the British chose was barely above the high water mark, and the prisoners were ordered to dig a common grave for the corpses. No religious prayers or litany was offered at these burials, only hurried digging and angry curses from the guards. The prisoners were pushed to finish and were then hastily moved back to the ship. It didn't take long for the high tides and rain to wash away the soil from the shallow common graves and to expose the arms and legs of the dead bodies for the rats and vermin to feast upon. A nearby Todd Mill's owner had a daughter who watched from a window the mass grave diggings on shore. She secretly kept a journal of the tallies for the dead that were buried, and it was from her notes that the authorities acquired accurate totals. Reports of cruel and inhumane treatment of the prisoners eventually reached Congress, but nothing was done. Their inaction caused George Washington to undertake the problem. So he wrote Lord William Howe on the 13th of January, 1777. My Lord, I am sorry that I am under the disagreeable necessity of troubling your lordship with a letter, almost wholly on the subject of the cruel treatment which our officers and men in the Naval Department, who are unhappy enough to fall into your hands, receive on board the prison ships in the harbor of New York. Without descending to particulars, I shall ground my complaint upon the matter contained in the enclosed paper, which is an exact copy of an account of the usage of the prisoners, delivered to Congress by a Captain Gamble, lately a prisoner himself in New York. From the opinion I have ever been taught to entertain of your lordship's humanity, I will not suppose that you are privy to proceedings of so cruel and unjustifiable a nature, and I hope that upon making the proper inquiry you will have the matter so regulated that the unhappy creatures whose lot is captivity may not in future have the miseries of cold, disease, and famine added to their other misfortunes. You may call us rebels and say that we deserve no better treatment, but remember, my lord, that supposing us rebels, we still have feelings equally as keen and sensible as loyalists, and will, if forced to it, most assuredly retaliate upon those upon whom we look as the unjust invaders of our rights, liberties, and properties. It took 2 years of British correspondence before there was any relief in the distressing conditions for the prisoners. However, prisoner improvements lasted for only a year, and after that, conditions for captured sailors grew worse than before. The British went so far as to offer the prisoners better living conditions if they enlisted in His Majesty's Navy. HMS Jersey was left in Wallabout Bay as a prison ship until she was abandoned at her moorings after the war. The rats took over, and as time passed, the shipworms ate the old hulk and she collapsed to rot in the mud. What was left of the Jersey could still be seen at low tide, and it was scorned by all who saw it. A pitiful reminder of misery and suffering. There was a ship. On the 4th of July, 1800, Mr. Jonathan Russell of Providence, Rhode Island, spoke of this ill-fated vessel and her victims. But it was not in the ardent conflicts of the field only that our countrymen fell. It was not the ordinary chances of war alone which they had to encounter. Happy indeed, thrice happy were Warren, Montgomery, and Mercer. Happy those other gallant spirits who fell with glory in the heat of the battle, distinguished by their country and covered with her applause. Every soul sensible to honor envies rather than compassionates their fate. It was in the dungeons of our inhuman invaders, it was in the loathsome and pestiferous prisons that the wretchedness of our countrymen still makes the heart bleed. It was there that hunger and thirst and disease and all the contumely that cold-hearted cruelty could bestow sharpened every pang of death. Misery there wrung every fiber that could feel before she gave the blow of grace which sent the sufferer to eternity. It is said that poison was employed. No, there was no such mercy there. There nothing was employed which could blunt the susceptibility to anguish, or which by hastening death could rob its agonies of a single pang. On board one only of these prison ships, above 11,000 of our brave countrymen are said to have perished. She was called the Jersey. Her wreck still remains, and at low ebb presents to the world its accursed and blighted fragments. Twice in 24 hours the winds of heaven sigh through it, and repeat the groans of her expiring countrymen. And twice the ocean hides in her bosom those deadly and polluted ruins, which all her waters cannot purify. Every rain that descends washes from the unconsecrated bank the bones of those intrepid sufferers. They lie naked on the shore, accusing the neglect of their countrymen. How long shall gratitude and even piety deny them burial? They ought to be collected in one vast ossuary, which shall stand a monument to future ages of the two extremes of human character, of that depravity which, trampling on the rights of misfortune, perpetuated cold and calculating murder on a wretched and defenseless prisoner, and that virtue which animated this prisoner to die a willing martyr to his country. Or rather, were it possible, there ought to be raised a colossal column whose base, sinking to hell, should let the murderers read their infamy inscribed upon it, and whose capital of Corinthian laurel, ascending to heaven, should show the sainted patriots that they have triumphed. Deep and dreadful as the coloring of this picture may appear, it is but a taint and imperfect sketch of the original. You must remember 1,000 unutterable calamities, 1,000 instances of domestic as well as national anxiety and distress, which mock description. You ought to remember them. You ought to hand them down in tradition to your posterity, that they may know the awful price their fathers paid for freedom. According to historical records, approximately 3,000 or more prisoners died a year on board the Jersey during its 3.5 years moored in the Wallabout Bay. The list of prisoner names from the Jersey that were copied from English war records was about 8,000, but even this number may be doubtful. In 1803, bones and skulls from the prisoners' burial grounds were found lying exposed on the muddy shores of Wallabout Bay. Civic organizations reburied the bones in the graveyard of the Dutch Reformed Church, when 5 years later these remains, as well as others that had become known, were placed in a sepulchre outside the Navy Yard wall. This vault was inscribed to their honor. In 1841, some workers were digging in an embankment on Jackson Street in Brooklyn near the Navy Yard when they unearthed human bones and a skeleton that still had iron manacles on its bony wrists. By 1855, the Martyr Monument Association was established, and by 1873, the bones were moved to Fort Greene Park, Brooklyn, New York. Plans and arrangements were executed to erect a suitable monument to the memory of those who died martyrs to the Revolution in the British prison ships of Wallabout Bay. Today, an imposing granite column that was designed by the famous Stanford White, known as the Prison Ship Martyrs Monument, sits on the site. At the base of this 150-foot column is a crypt that entombs the bones of the prisoners. It was dedicated by President Taft on the 14th of November, 1908, while thousands of people attended to pay homage to these lost men of war. These men were patriots who died for their country even though they didn't have a fighting chance against a ruthless enemy. After the Revolutionary War ended, a notice was published on the 18th of May, 1783 in a Fishkill, New York paper. To all printers of public newspapers, tell it to the world and let it be published in every newspaper throughout America, Europe, Asia, and Africa, to the everlasting disgrace and infamy of the British King's commanders at New York, that during the late war it is said that 11,644 American prisoners have suffered death by their inhuman, cruel, savage, and barbarous usage on board the filthy and malignant British prison ship called the Jersey, lying at New York. Britons tremble, lest the vengeance of heaven fall on your isle for the blood of these unfortunate victims. Unfortunately, for our revolutionary patriots, the U.S. Constitution had not been created until the 17th of September, 1787, and our patriots were left exposed to be inflicted with cruelty and unusual punishments from the British if they were captured. Our patriots fought anyway because they wanted independence from control of the British Crown. But for those of us today, we were born with the protection of the U.S. Constitution, though for how long is up to us. The Constitution's 8th Amendment prohibits more than just cruel and unusual punishments. It protects American citizens from any savage or merciless treatments from domestic criminals and institutions. Today, the Supreme Court's Eighth Amendment doctrine has two branches. The first branch governs the punishments that are given in response to a crime, whether the punishment is unequal to the severity of the crime. And the second branch of the Eighth Amendment examines policies and conditions within prisons. The Supreme Court divides punishments in two groups of cases. First group determines the term of years sentence if it's unequal to the crime committed. The second group considers a particular punishment if it's irregular for a certain offense or class of offenders. Today, we watch the abusive and cruel treatment to our American citizens, jailed by a corrupt, communist, Marxist, two-tiered justice system. These prisoners were entrapped during the U.S. Capitol open house on the 6th of January, 2021, and many still remain in prison awaiting trial. They're being convicted and sent to prison under fraudulently invented charges, such as alleged insurrectionists, by a D.C. kangaroo court trials. After 2021, approximately more than 1,000 Americans have been arrested 2.8 years later. The corrupt Biden Department of Justice initially instructed federal judges and the D.C. District Court to deny these political prisoners a release based on fraudulent comparability to 9/11 terrorists that apparently continues. Julie Kelly Declassified reports on the 20th of August, 2023. By far the most common charge brought against January 6 defendants is violating 40 U.S.C. Section 5104E2G, parading, picketing, or demonstrating in a Capitol building. The Class B misdemeanor also has resulted in the most plea agreements in what the Biden Justice Department calls the Capitol Siege investigation. But DOJ's use the parading offense is just another example of how certain laws have been weaponized to criminalize political speech and dissent. In fact, none other than the former Chief Judge of the Federal District Court of Washington, D.C., questioned the DOJ's unusual application of the parading statute nearly 2 years ago. Other prisoners complained the jail was an abomination where they were all but slowly murdered in every way except for their very soul being ripped from their famished chests. More grievances included skimpy meals and objectionable facilities, limited access to proper legal services, bullying from the guards, unwanted vaccine requirements. Back in December 2021, the U.S. Marshal Service made an unannounced inspection that found inhumane conditions, which led to the removal of half the prisoners. The Marshals described the jail as an evisceration facility of the body, mind, and soul. Prisoners were begging for help. They needed water and medical aid. Worms were found in salads. They suffered from hair loss, vision problems, and endured scurvy from malnutrition. Our January 6 political prisoners are a high-level alarm of communist Marxist politicians and their disciples determined to deceive and subvert, including using sadistic tactics that will continue to escalate beyond the civil and the humane if ignored. They do not tolerate organized opposition because they want total control over society. We, the people, must be as dedicated to ridding our country of this communist evil, just as the communists are dedicated to their cause to destroy the free world's way of life. Freedom is not free. Please remember its awful price.